Hello, and thank you for joining our PSC form to CPO process integration demo. This demo assumes knowledge of Cisco Prime Service Catalog and Cisco Process Orchestrator fundamentals. Prime Service Catalog employs data retrieval rules, conditional rules, and ISF script on top of data sources, standards, and service items in order to create rich, interactive user forms. Typically, Prime Service Catalog integrates with Process Orchestrator by means of a service link agent. The agent is invoked using the steps of the service plan workflow. This always takes place after form submission. Our specific use case, however, requires data retrieval from an external system, populating form fields based on user selection interaction, much like a data retrieval rule. Here we extend the active form component functionality to execute process orchestrator processes directly from form events. AJAX calls from the web browser client initiate workflow execution via custom JSP proxy. The goal of this integration is to use form field data as workflow input and to populate data back onto the form using output parameter data. We achieve this goal by naming the process orchestrator parameters after the form dictionary fields. Using our naming convention, it is possible to use a form field for input and to update the same form field with data output from the workflow. We have three supported data types. Scalars are normal strings and numbers. Scalar lists are multi-line strings, which are handy for populating drop-down lists. Table parameters correspond to PSC grid dictionaries. Before we jump into the example demo, let's take a look at the three main components that provide the integration functionality. The first is the synchronization workflow. This queries the Cisco Process Orchestrator API REST endpoint for a list of process definitions. Process input and output variables are then stored in a PSC standards table. This ensures that our integration process will know which form fields to use as workflow input and output variables. The second component is the ISF JavaScript that gets attached to the desired form event under the Active Form Behavior tab of the Service Designer. The only required parameter here is the workflow name. This component gets the variables for the workflow input, compiles and runs the AJAX request to invoke the workflow, then sets the output values back onto the form fields. The last component is the JSP proxy that facilitates the communication between the PSC form and the CPO API. This component does three things. First, it starts the process instance with the required input variables. Secondly, it will poll the API until the process is complete. Third, it returns output variables to the HTTP response body back onto the form. All this happens behind the scenes and requires no further setup once it is initially deployed. Now, let's look at our demo in action. The first dropdown you see on the form was populated using a standard data retrieval rule. However, when the user selects a value from here, we want to execute the CPO workflow to get values for the next drop-down list. This is how we will go about it. This is the workflow we want executed when the drop-down selection changes. It will take the selected value of the drop-down as an input and provide a list of values as an output. As you can see, we have the description field of the process to start with the word sync me. This indicates to the synchronization process that we want this process's input and output variables stored in the PSC standards table for lookup. Furthermore, we ensure that the input and output variables match the form field names in the format dictionary name.fieldName, as can be seen in our input and output variables for this workflow. To synchronize these variables, we need to go to the process and start the synchronization. Here we see our variables synchronized to the Prime Service Catalog standards table. We have to repeat this step anytime variables are changed, added, or removed from workflows in CPO. Finally, our JavaScript is linked to the onChange event of the desired form field. Notice that the second dropdown has no values at all. Once we select our values from the initially populated top dropdown, the process will be fired off in CPO and our second dropdown should be populated. Now, as we go back into Process Orchestrator and refresh the processes screen, we will see an additional workflow has been kicked off by the form. When we select this instance of the workflow, we can see that the outputs match the values that are now populated within the drop-down box on the PSC form. Similarly, selecting a value on the second drop-down will again populate the next. To illustrate that different types of variables can be used at once, we've implemented a more complex workflow to populate the below values. Here we can see that more than one field was populated, as well as a grid. It is also possible for developers to further extend this functionality by making use of on-success and on-failure handlers provided by the script. To demonstrate this, we've implemented a simple validator which provides the entire table as an input to the workflow. The workflow will iterate the values and return a list of values that are invalid, in this case anything greater than 1024, together with a friendly error message. Our custom code will iterate the list and change the background color of the invalid records. Let's take another quick look at the steps we needed to take to accomplish this. First off, we built a PSC active form component. Thereafter, we built out a workflow and specified the sync me description to ensure that it synchronizes with PSC. We also ensured that the input and output variables correspond to the dictionary field names on the active form component. Thereafter, it was a question of running the synchronization process for PSC to have the input and output variables in its standards table. Finally, it was just a question of attaching the trigger CPO workflow JavaScript to the correct form event. Now, suppose we needed to add an additional field for the configuration item. The first step would be to add the field to our dictionary. Next, we need our workflow to output this variable. Notice that this variable is only returning a single value and won't be used to populate drop-down lists. Now we need to also ensure that this variable is set. With the workflow now adjusted to include this output variable, we need to redo the synchronization process for PSC to be aware of this output variable. Once the synchronization is done, the form should be ready to receive our new variable. And there we have our new CI tag value. And that wraps up our PSC form to CPO process integration demo. Thank you for watching and hope you found it informative. Goodbye.